We would like to send out a special thanks to Best Fiends for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Best Fiends is a unique and exciting puzzle experience unlike other puzzle games out there. Best Fiends updates the game monthly with new levels and events, so it never gets old. Download free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. Thank you, and enjoy the episode. Hello everyone, before I begin the episode, I would just like to make a quick announcement. By popular demand, The Trail Went Cold is going to be closing off 2020 with another special Q&A episode, much like the one we released 2 years ago. This means you can send me in questions about myself, the podcast, or any other subject, and I will record my answers to them for the episode, which will be released on December the 30th. If you would like to send in some questions, please send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Q&A to robin.warder@icloud.com. The deadline for sending them in is December the 16th. Thank you, and enjoy the episode. December 17th, 1988. Miami, Florida. 23-year-old journalism student Lisa Bishop leaves on a trip to Haiti on a boat called the Freedon, which is being captained by a German national named Florian Meyer Bourch. When they do not arrive at the destination, and Lisa fails to contact her family, a search from the Coast Guard fails to find the missing boat. Months later, an eyewitness reports having seen the Freedon in Grand Cayman weeks after it originally went missing, and residents of the island recall having seen Florian during that time period. This leads to speculation that the Freedon may have been involved in a smuggling operation, but no trace of Lisa, Florian, or the ship's crew are ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring two separate mysteries involving boats named the Freedon and the Casie Nicole. Both of these stories were featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and I've received numerous requests to cover them, but since there isn't a ton of information available about either case, I decided to combine them together for this episode. Most of the time, whenever a boat goes out on the water and vanishes without a trace, there's an obvious solution to the mystery, but these particular stories are a lot more complicated than that. The central figure in the Freedon case was a young journalism student named Lisa Bishop, who was hoping to travel to Haiti to write a story about their economic conditions, and received the opportunity when a friend of hers named Florian Meyer Bourch offered to take her there on a boat he had chartered called the Freedon. After they set sail from Miami, Lisa was never seen again, but there would be subsequent eyewitness sightings of both Florian and the ship itself, which seemed to suggest that Lisa's disappearance may not have been caused by a simple sinking. As for the Casie Nicole, that was the name of a boat which 4 men from Georgia were using to take a fishing expedition into the Atlantic until it started sinking and they were forced to abandon it. One of the men, Nathan Neesmith, became separated from the others and managed to survive the ordeal until he was rescued, but his 3 companions were never found. Months later, a series of odd phone calls would take place to suggest that the missing men might actually still be alive somewhere, being held against their will. Anyway, I'm going to start out by talking about the Freedon case and providing my theories and analysis, and then I'll move on to discussing the saga of the Casie Nicole. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the mysterious disappearance of the Freedon. Our first story begins in 1988, and our first central figure is 23-year-old Lisa Bishop, who originally hails from the town of Riverdale, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. Lisa is a journalism major who is currently finishing up her senior year at Georgia State University and has developed a particular fascination with the Republic of Haiti and is hoping to travel there someday in order to write a story about how Haiti's devastating economic conditions compare to the United States. For the past 3 years, Lisa has been involved in a relationship with her boyfriend, Paul Cornwell, and works at an Atlanta nightclub Paul owns called the Metroplex. While there, Lisa would cross paths with a 28-year-old German national named Florian Meyer Bourch, who lived a fairly transient lifestyle but had recently settled in Miami and often liked to travel to Atlanta to frequent the Metroplex because it often played host to Caribbean reggae bands. Florian worked as a diesel mechanic, but also claimed he was a sea captain who liked to sail around the Caribbean. Lisa and Florian became friends, and after learning about Lisa's desire to travel to Haiti, he eventually informed her that he was planning to take a 2-week trip there on a boat he had chartered. Florian asked Lisa if she would like to accompany him on his trip, and since the ship would have a full crew, he could sign her aboard there as a cook. Lisa accepted Florian's invitation, but needless to say, her boyfriend, as well as her parents, Bill and Linda Bishop, were none too pleased about her decision and did not trust Florian. The night before she left, Lisa and Paul had a long conversation about this trip, and she assured him there was nothing going on between her and Florian. Paul still tried to discourage Lisa from going, but ultimately realized that nothing was going to change her mind. On December the 17th, Lisa traveled down to Miami and joined Florian at the boat he had chartered, an 82-foot diesel-powered steel freighter named the Freedon, which was often used as a cargo ship. They would be accompanied on their trip by 7 Haitian crew members, and the route would involve traveling around 650 miles through the Old Bahama Channel until they reached their port in Gonaive, located on the western coast of Haiti. Since the weather was cold and the water choppy that day, Florian apparently proposed the idea of delaying the trip, but Lisa was pretty insistent about them leaving immediately. Lisa made one final phone call to her parents and assured them she would call again after she arrived in Haiti. Shortly after Lisa's call ended, the Freedon set sail at around 2:30 p.m., but it would eventually vanish without explanation. Over the course of the next week, neither Lisa's family or her boyfriend heard from her, and when she failed to phone them on Christmas Day, they started to become seriously concerned. Lisa was scheduled to return from Haiti on New Year's Eve, but this did not take place, so her family decided to contact the United States Coast Guard. They confirmed that there had been no reported distress calls from the Freedon, and while the Coast Guard contacted numerous port authorities located in Haiti and throughout the Caribbean, none of them had any record of the ship having arrived. The Freedon's route would have taken it along the coast of Cuba, but they had no information about the missing boat either. Falcon jets spent a week flying across the Old Bahama Channel to search for the Freedon, but could not find any trace of the missing ship or evidence to suggest it might have sunk. While there were no reported storms during the time period after the Freedon left Miami, the Coast Guard did acknowledge that the Florida Straits could sometimes be very turbulent and hit by very sudden, violent storms that quickly erased any evidence of a disaster. Since they were not receiving much assistance from governmental agencies, Linda Bishop and Paul Cornwell both decided to travel to Miami in order to speak with some of Florian's friends who lived there, and it turned out that none of them had heard from Florian or the 7 Haitian crew members who were on board the Freedon. Things took a surprising turn in April of 1989 when the Bishops were contacted by a man named Bob Nyberg, who worked as an underwater salvager. Nyberg had recently read an article about the disappearance of the Freedon, which was published in the Miami New Times, and became convinced he had seen the missing boat over 2 weeks after it originally left Miami. In January, Nyberg had traveled to Grand Cayman, the largest of the 3 Cayman Islands, and was doing some underwater salvage work at Georgetown Harbor when he noticed a ship docking there with the word Freedon written on the side. Nyberg made a joke to his friend about how the owners of the boat must have misspelled freedom, which is why he was able to distinctly remember it when he read the article about the Freedon months later. According to Nyberg, the boat was gone when he returned to the harbor the following day, but this only raised more unanswered questions since Grand Cayman was over 500 miles west of Gonaive, the Freedon's original destination in Haiti. On the basis of this new information, both Nyberg and Paul Cornwell would decide to travel to Grand Cayman in order to perform their own search for Lisa. The 2 men spoke to a number of witnesses in Georgetown and showed them Lisa's photograph, but while none of them recalled seeing her, a few of the witnesses did recognize Florian from his photo. They recalled having seen him months earlier during the same approximate time period when Nyberg saw the Freedon, and some of them said that Florian was with a short man with black hair. In the end, they had no success at finding Florian, but after leaving the island and returning to Atlanta, Paul spoke to a woman who had been in charge of storing Florian's belongings while he was away on his trip. She had also not heard from Florian since he left, so she agreed to let Paul look through his possessions, where he came across a photograph of a short man with black hair who matched the description of the man seen with Florian in Grand Cayman. The woman said the man's name was Felipe, and that he was the one who originally chartered the Freedon. She had a personal relationship with Felipe, and he apparently told her that both he and Florian had become involved with a large-scale smuggling operation. No one was ever able to track down Felipe, but the case would attain national exposure when it was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in October of 1990. Lisa's family hoped that if Florian was still alive somewhere, someone watching might be able to provide the authorities with his current whereabouts so that they could find him and question him about Lisa's disappearance. But in the end, no trace of Lisa, Florian, or the other 7 missing Haitian crew members was ever found, and there's still no conclusive answers about what exactly happened to the Freedon. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Best Fiends. I'm always hearing from new listeners who discovered the trail went cold not too long ago and have binged all of our episodes, but now that they're finished, their first question is, now what? What do I do now that I have to wait an entire week for a new episode of the podcast to drop? Well, if you've just binged through over 200 episodes about unsolved cold cases and gone down major rabbit holes, it might be a good time to unwind and relieve some of the stress from your brain, so this provides a great opportunity to clear a few levels on Best Fiends. Best Fiends is the infamously impossible to put down puzzle game with over 100 million downloads and counting. It's free to download and has literally millions of 5-star reviews on the Apple App Store and Google Play. More levels, events, and challenges get added all the time, which means that you don't have to choose between binging and boredom. Seriously, once you download Best Fiends, boredom won't stand a chance. Since the last time I recorded one of these ads, I have cracked level 900, and am feeling the excitement of edging ever so closer to that magic 1000 mark. It's a great way to de-stress during the ample amount of time I spend researching podcast episodes and recording them. So download Best Fiends free today from the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of our episode. So this is one of those dreaded unsolved mystery stories in which there's very little information available outside the original segment, aside from a handful of newspaper articles. And that's pretty frustrating, because there are a ton of unanswered questions about this case which require more clarification. At the outset, I get the impression that after the Freedon was reported missing, and the Coast Guard had no luck finding it, they came to the conclusion that the boat likely sank. While it sounds like there weren't any reports of major storms, which took place during the time period after the boat left Miami, it did sail through an area that is known for being hit by sudden violent storms, which happen so quickly that they barely make a blip on the radar. These storms can also erase all evidence that a ship sank, and that would explain why the Coast Guard never found any trace of wreckage during their aerial searches. If that's all there was to this story, then I doubt it would have been featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but everything changed when Bob Nyberg came forward and reported having seen the Freedon in Grand Cayman weeks after it supposedly went missing. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the term missing white woman syndrome, which is commonly used in true crime circles to describe the media's tendency to disproportionately focus on attractive young white women who go missing, while ignoring similar cases involving persons of color. Well, the Unsolved Mysteries segment almost takes this cliche to the extreme, as they place all their focus on Lisa Bishop and her potentially sinister male companion, Florian Meyer Bourch, but then just casually mention, oh yeah, there were 7 other Haitian crew members on the ship who went missing as well. To say that the crew members are treated as a complete afterthought is an understatement, as we don't even learn their names or any details about them. The segment puts a heavy emphasis on the relationship between Lisa and Florian, and the possibility that Florian might have been involved in something illegal which put Lisa's life in danger, but if Florian was still alive somewhere, what happened to the 7 missing crew members? Well, in 2017, someone made a post about this case in the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit I'm always referencing, and while I'd like to mention their username, it seems like they've since deleted their Reddit account. This poster claimed that they managed to get in touch with Lisa's former boyfriend, Paul Cornwell, and shared a few interesting tidbits of information. Apparently, Paul had managed to make contact with Florian's family in Hamburg, Germany, and learned that neither they or any of Florian's other acquaintances had heard from him since 1988. Paul also supposedly got in touch with the families of the missing Haitian crew members, and they said the exact same thing. If it's true that none of the 9 people who were on the Freedon have been accounted for in over 30 years, then this does lend credence to the idea that the boat simply sank with everyone on board. Another tidbit mentioned in that post is that Paul attempted to track down the mysterious Felipe, who was known for traveling between islands on a white boat, but it sounds like he never found him. And curiously, Paul also apparently claimed that there was a more recent sighting of the Freedon by someone in the Navy, which took place about 3 or 4 years before that Reddit post was made. So right now, let's examine what we do know about this case. Even though there isn't a ton of information out there about Lisa Bishop, there's actually no shortage of info available on Paul Cornwell, as he has become a fairly prominent pro-marijuana activist in Atlanta. In fact, in June of 2018, Paul was featured in an article published by the Atlanta-based civic website Supporter Report, and it looks like he currently owns an establishment called The Pot Shop, which had the distinction of being Georgia's first official cannabis retail store. As you recall, Paul had previously owned a nightclub called the Metroplex, but he closed it down shortly after Lisa went missing. In a tragic postscript to that story, the abandoned building burned down in December of 1990 when 4 homeless men went in there and built a fire to keep warm, but it wound up escalating out of control and took their lives. Anyway, it was while working at the Metroplex when Lisa first became acquainted with Florian Meyer Bourch, and as you can imagine, Paul was not overjoyed when she accepted Florian's invitation to accompany him to Haiti. Lisa always assured Paul that she and Florian were just friends and there was nothing going on between them, but while that may very well be true, you can understand the skepticism, as the few available photos of Florian kind of make him look like a long-haired male supermodel. While he was apparently a charismatic and charming guy, it sounds like Lisa's parents really didn't like him, believing that he was a drifter who liked to sponge off of people. Now, to be fair, since Florian was a frequent patron at the Metroplex, It sounds like he and Lisa had known each other off and on for about a year before they planned this Haiti trip, so it's not like he was a complete stranger to her. But from today's perspective, I'm sure that many people watching the Unsolved Mysteries segment for the first time are practically shouting at the screen, "Lisa, don't get on that boat." The details are sketchy about how Florian wound up captaining the Freedon to begin with, but apparently it was chartered by his mysterious friend Felipe, and according to that Reddit post I just mentioned, the boat was officially registered to a Haitian woman living in Miami who has since passed away. But I have no idea how Florian connected with those 7 Haitian crew members, and while I've given the Unsolved Mysteries segment slack for not mentioning their names, perhaps no one even knew their names at that time. I guess it's possible there's documentation somewhere listing everyone on the Freedon's crew, but it sounds like a lot of the details might have been secondhand information provided by Lisa. There are 2 photographs of the Freedon displayed on screen in the Unsolved Mysteries segment, and it appears to have a lot of items, such as bicycles, cluttering the deck, so I'm assuming that the main purpose of the journey was to deliver these items to Haiti. Quite frankly, the boat looks like a pretty junky vessel, and I get the impression that it would not be particularly resilient if it wound up getting trapped in a violent storm. It's true that the weather and the water were not great on the day the Freedon left Miami, so much so that Florian considered postponing their departure until Lisa insisted they leave that afternoon. That's why it's not hard to imagine that the ship could have run into a storm on the Florida Straits and sank to the bottom. However, the big complication in this story is Bob Nyberg's sighting of the Freedon in Grand Cayman, which apparently took place in early January of 1989, over 2 weeks after the boat left. According to Lisa, they were scheduled to return to Miami on New Year's Eve, and since Grand Cayman is over 500 miles off course, there didn't seem to be any reason for the Freedon to be there. Now, I've mentioned countless times that it's very easy for eyewitnesses in missing persons cases to be mistaken about who they saw, but here, the witness did not see a person, but a boat which had a very distinct name. Indeed, I'm not sure why anyone decided to name their boat the Freedon, and you have to wonder if this was the result of some sort of language barrier because the original Haitian owner meant to use the word freedom. Ironically enough, I previously did a podcast episode about another Unsolved Mysteries case which aired about 2 years before this one, involving a missing young woman named Kristen Tomlin, who vanished after taking a voyage on a boat named the Freedom 2. My point is that seeing a boat with the word Freedon written on the side is a distinct enough experience that I can believe Nyberg would have remembered it when he read an article about the Freedon months later. I mean, what are the odds of another similar-looking ship sailing through the Caribbean with that name? So if Nyberg's sighting is accurate, this suggests that something a lot darker than a sinking might have taken place. Perhaps the Freedon was taken over by pirates who killed everyone on board, dumped their bodies into the water, and stole the ship before sailing to Grand Cayman. But the additional complication is that there were numerous eyewitnesses on the island who were certain they recognized Florian and had seen him there around the approximate time period the Freedon was alleged to have arrived. Once Paul Cornwell learned from Florian's female acquaintance in Atlanta that he may have been involved in smuggling, this raised the possibility that Lisa may have been murdered to cover up her knowledge of Florian's illegal activity. In fact, an unsettling theory which has been pushed forward during online discussions of this case is that Florian was involved in human trafficking and brought Lisa into the Caribbean to sell her off as a sex slave. I'm sure one of the main reasons this particular theory has picked up steam over the years is because of the famous 1998 disappearance of Amy Bradley, a young American woman who vanished from a cruise ship while it was traveling through the Caribbean, leading to a lot of unconfirmed rumors that she had been abducted and forced into sex slavery. Many of the sightings of Florian in Grand Cayman also placed him in the company of a man who was believed to be his mysterious friend, Felipe, who was also alleged to be involved in large-scale smuggling. But of course, as with most eyewitness sightings, the big question is how reliable they actually are. Granted, Florian is a pretty distinctive-looking individual who would probably stand out in a crowd, so I can definitely believe some witnesses did legitimately see him there. But since Florian apparently told Lisa that he often liked to sail around the Caribbean, could the witnesses have been mistaken about the time period and actually saw Florian in Grand Cayman before the Freedon went missing? That's another thing you have to take into account about Bob Nyberg's sighting. He may be completely telling the truth about having seen the Freedon, but he could have been mistaken about when he actually saw it. I would be curious to know if there are any records of the Freedon ever having sailed to Grand Cayman prior to December the 17th, 1988. The enigmatic Felipe is definitely the wild card in the story. While it doesn't sound like anyone ever tracked him down, Florian apparently had a photograph of him in his possessions, so it seems like Felipe did actually exist. But I've always wondered why Paul was so certain that Felipe was the same guy seen with Florian at Grand Cayman, since this person was described as a short man with black hair. Even if Felipe was short and had black hair, that description is about as vague as you can get. The problem with the theory that smuggling played a role in Lisa's disappearance is that it sounds like the only real source of the claims that Florian and Felipe were involved in smuggling is the woman from Atlanta who was storing Florian's belongings. There's not much information available about her either, only that she knew Florian and Felipe and may have been involved with one or both of them at some point. But the whole smuggling angle is really based on nothing more than hearsay and conjecture, and may have no relevance to this story at all. If it wasn't for the reported sightings of Florian and the Freedon in Grand Cayman, I think everyone would have just assumed that the boat's disappearance was a tragic sinking, and there wouldn't be any talk about smuggling or potential foul play. I think the biggest issue with believing that some sort of murderous conspiracy took place is the fact that not one of the 7 unnamed Haitian crew members seem to have resurfaced within the past 30 years. If that aforementioned Reddit post is accurate, and Paul Cornwell received confirmation from the crew's families that they never heard from them, then this definitely lends credence to the idea that the ship sank somewhere. In spite of the sightings of Florian, I find it unlikely that he could have killed Lisa and all those crew members himself before commandeering the Freedon and traveling to Grand Cayman. And it sounds like Paul verified that Florian's family had also not heard from him since 1988, which suggests that he is no longer with us either. I mean, I guess it's possible that Florian and Felipe were legitimately involved in illegal smuggling, which would explain why they chartered a cargo ship, but the angle may be nothing more than a red herring, and the ship just wound up sinking because it ran into a violent storm before it reached Haiti. While I do think Bob Nyberg's sighting of the Freedon in Grand Cayman is interesting, we can probably chalk it up to him being mistaken about the time period he saw it. Or an even more mundane explanation is that Nyberg actually saw an altogether different boat named the Freedom, but the N had become faded and looked like an M. If you discount the Nyberg sighting, I think the most logical explanation is that the ship sank and is still resting in a watery grave somewhere, waiting to be discovered. All that being said, if you happen to know this isn't the case, and have any information about the whereabouts of Lisa Bishop, Florian Meyer Bourch, or the 7 missing crew members, please contact the appropriate authorities. So now let's move on to our next story about the Casie Nicole. Our second story begins in Georgia in 1990, and our central figure is 32-year-old Nathan Neesmith, who lives in the town of Darien with his wife and 2 children. Nathan and most of the other members of the Neesmith family, including his 23-year-old brother Billy Joe, make their living as commercial fishermen. Nathan and Billy Joe have decided that they want to take a 7-day fishing expedition through the Atlantic Ocean and would be accompanied by their 18-year-old nephew, Keith Wilkes, as well as a 23-year-old friend named Franklin Brantley. The group would borrow a 34-foot fiberglass snapper boat called the Casie Nicole from Billy Joe's employer, Doug Tyson, and Billy Joe would function as the captain. 5 weeks earlier, the Casie Nicole had been damaged in an offshore storm and underwent maintenance at a repair yard in the town of Richmond Hill. On April the 11th, the 4 men picked up the boat and set sail into the ocean at around noon, with their intended destination being Tiger Ridge, a fishing area located approximately 80 miles away off the coast of South Carolina. Sometime between 3:30 and 4 a.m. on the morning of April 12th, Nathan woke up to start operating the boat, but noticed that it was acting quite sluggish, and he had trouble keeping it on course. Nathan proceeded to wake up Billy Joe and bring him to the control panel, and they noticed that the boat was riding a few feet deep in the water. When they opened the compartment containing the engine, they discovered that it was filled with water, and their pumps were no longer operable. Nathan and Billy Joe went down into the bow area, where Keith and Franklin were sleeping, and saw that a foot of water was now on the floor next to their bunks. In order to prevent the boat from sinking, the 4 men on board started using buckets to scoop up the water and toss it overboard. While Billy Joe got on the radio and made an unsuccessful attempt to call for help, Nathan pulled out the life raft, but it wasn't long before the engines completely stalled. Since the Casie Nicole no longer had any power, the crew now had no choice but to abandon ship. They took food and water with them, but unfortunately, the life raft was only equipped to carry 2 people, and it turned out there was a small hole on the side, which was about the size of a quarter. As a result, the raft had a difficult time sustaining the weight of all 4 men as they drifted away from the boat. When sunrise hit, the group noticed that the wooden 3.5 by 7 foot hatch cover had become detached from the Casie Nicole and was now floating in the water, so they decided to grab it. After tying and tethering it to the raft, the men climbed on top of the hatch cover, but Nathan noticed the hull of the Casie Nicole about 3 or 4 miles in the distance. Even though the others advised him against it, Nathan decided it was worth another shot to use the boat to get help, so he started swimming back towards it, leaving the food and water behind with his 3 companions. While it took him several hours to complete the lengthy swim, Nathan finally made it back to the Casie Nicole. The boat had nearly sunk, but since its stern was still popping up out of the water, Nathan grabbed onto it. By this point, Nathan had become very weak, and the sun was starting to set. Once it got dark, Nathan lost sight of the 3 men on the hatch cover in the distance, and he would spend the entire night clinging onto the stern. When morning arrived, Nathan noticed a freighter moving through the ocean about 3 or 4 miles away. According to Nathan, it appeared to be around the same spot where his 3 companions had been floating on the hatch cover, and the freighter spent a lot of time circling around. It seemed to come to a stop about 4 or 5 times, and Nathan wondered if it might have been picking the other men up. After 3 hours, the freighter finally disappeared, and Nathan never saw it again, as he continued to remain drifting on the Casie Nicole's stern for the next few days. At one point, a large wood and styrofoam rectangular-shaped bait box broke loose from the boat's deck and rose up to the surface of the water. Since he was worried that the Casie Nicole would not be able to stay afloat much longer, Nathan decided to swim over to the bait box, and since the entire front was missing, he was able to climb into it and use it as a flotation device. Things got to the point where Nathan felt he was on the verge of death, but at around 9 a.m. on the morning of April the 16th, 2 men on a fishing boat finally happened upon the bait box and rescued Nathan. It turned out that the location where Nathan was found was about 20 miles east of South Carolina's Hilton Head Island. He had been drifting without food and water for 4 days and had large blisters and severe sunburns on his skin, and he was also heavily swollen from the constant exposure to salt water. Nathan was airlifted to the intensive care unit of a medical center, where he received treatment for hypothermia and dehydration and ultimately made a full recovery. The Coast Guard would perform a full-scale search for Billy Joe, Keith, and Franklin, but unfortunately, they were unable to find any trace of the men. They also failed to turn up the hatch cover and life raft they had been using, though they did manage to find a life vest and sleeping bag, as well as the capsized Casie Nicole. Billy Joe, Keith, and Franklin continued to remain missing for the next 6 months, and most people assumed they had probably drowned, but the story would take an unusual turn on October the 5th, when an odd phone call came into the home of Nathan and Billy Joe's sister, Onita Drawdy. Onita's mother-in-law answered the phone and claimed that she had heard an unidentified man who was speaking Spanish. Even though she attempted to communicate with him, he did not seem to understand English, but he kept repeating Onita's phone number as well as her name before the line went dead. The call on its own might have not seemed unusual, but 6 weeks later, Onita spoke to Doug Tyson, the original owner of the Casie Nicole, and it turned out that he had received a similar phone call on the exact same day. Doug's wife answered the phone, and once again, the caller was an unidentified man who spoke Spanish and kept repeating their name and phone number before he abruptly hung up. Over the course of the next 5 months, Onita would receive 3 more similar calls from a man speaking Spanish, while the Tysons received 2. On March the 6th, 1991, Onita received yet another call from a man with a Spanish accent, only this time he kept repeating the same sentence in English, quote, "I'm bringing them home." This would turn out to be the last call that Onita or the Tysons ever received, but given that the primary connection between them was the incident with the Casie Nicole, this led to speculation that the calls were somehow connected to the disappearances of Billy Joe, Keith, and Franklin. Nathan speculated that the 3 men may have been picked up by the freighter he had seen while he was clinging to the Casie Nicole, and if the crew of the freighter were involved in something illegal, they may have decided to kidnap the 3 men and hold them against their will in a foreign country. It was possible that the anonymous caller was attempting to contact the men's family members and acquaintances to let them know what happened, but had trouble communicating because he did not speak English. Nathan reached out to Unsolved Mysteries and shared the story with them, in hopes that they would profile it, and the show agreed to produce a segment about the disappearances. The episode featuring the segment aired in January of 1992, but unfortunately, it failed to bring about any new leads. After more than 30 years, the whereabouts of Billy Joe Neesmith, Keith Wilkes, and Franklin Brantley continue to remain unknown. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So even if you take out all the mysterious elements, Nathan Neesmith's survival is still a pretty remarkable story on its own, though of course, the whole situation was still a major tragedy for him, the missing victims, and their families. It's a miracle that Nathan even lived to share this story, and for that reason, if you look up online discussions about the case, you will find some skepticism expressed by people who wonder if Nathan's story is even true to begin with. Well, before you go pointing any fingers at Nathan, keep in mind that this whole incident would have been investigated by law enforcement when it originally happened, and not once have they ever expressed any indication that Nathan is lying. In fact, he was the one who took the initiative to contact Unsolved Mysteries in the first place because he wanted answers about what happened to his 3 missing companions. If you want to make a comparison with another Unsolved Mysteries case where someone died a very suspicious death after abandoning a sinking boat on a life raft, look at their final appeal segment about Larry Race, who lost his wife Debbie to hypothermia under similar circumstances, but provided a story which was so full of holes that he wound up being charged and convicted of her murder. I see nothing to indicate that's the situation with Nathan Neesmith, so I think we can shut down all discussion about his story being a lie and him possibly being culpable in the deaths of his brother, nephew, and friend. Considering how close to death Nathan was after being out on the ocean for 4 days without food and water, I have no reason to doubt that the events unfolded exactly how he described them. Given that the Casie Nicole had recently undergone repairs after sustaining damage in a storm, it does not seem unbelievable to me that it would have run into all these problems and wound up sinking. I guess the main reason some online sleuths have expressed suspicion about Nathan is because after the 4 men abandoned the Casie Nicole in the life raft and climbed on top of the hatch cover, Nathan made the decision to swim 3 or 4 miles back to the boat. You might be wondering why he would decide to do that and leave his 3 companions behind, considering that they left the Casie Nicole to begin with because it was sinking, but I think you can chalk that up to a few factors. For starters, anyone who finds themselves in a situation like this is going to be panicky and may not always make what seems like the most rational decisions. The life raft was not designed to hold 4 people and had a hole in it, so it was probably on the verge of sinking, and even though they were lucky enough to come across the hatch cover, I get the sense that it still would have been difficult for the cover to support the weight of 4 men for an extended period of time. Given the circumstances, I can see why Nathan would have thought that swimming back to the Casie Nicole would have been worth another shot, and he even let the others keep all the remaining food and water. In the end, this actually turned out to be the correct decision for Nathan, since he wound up being rescued, and the other 3 men are still missing to this day. But I have no doubt that Nathan probably feels some serious survivor's guilt about the whole situation. Of course, much like the victims on the Freedon, the disappearances of Billy Joe Neesmith, Keith Wilkes, and Franklin Brantley probably wouldn't seem all that mysterious if not for the series of bizarre phone calls which took place over the course of the next several months. Given how Nathan barely survived after spending nearly 4 days clinging to the stern of a sunken boat and lying inside a bait box, it's reasonable to assume that 3 men would have had difficulty lasting that same amount of time while floating on top of a hatch cover, so the most logical explanation is that they simply drowned and their bodies were never found. However, the aforementioned phone calls, as well as Nathan's sighting of the mysterious freighter, cannot be ignored. According to Nathan, this freighter seemed to be in the same vicinity where his 3 companions were floating, and since he saw it circling around for 3 hours and stop a couple times, he assumed the freighter might be picking the men up. But of course they were never heard from again, so if the freighter did pick them up, then something a lot more sinister must have happened. Now, it's possible that the freighter never saw the 3 men, and since it had been a full day since Nathan was with them, they may have already been drowned by that point, since I'm not sure the life raft or the hatch cover were long for this world. However, another possibility is that Nathan's eyes could have been playing tricks on him. During his recovery in the hospital, Nathan gave an interview with the press where he described being so delirious during his ordeal that he started hearing voices call out his name, but whenever he looked in the voices' direction, he did not see anyone. Going days without food and water will do that to a person, so I won't rule out the idea that the freighter may have just been a mirage and Nathan completely hallucinated the whole thing. But what about the possibility that the crew of the freighter picked up Billy Joe, Keith, and Franklin and proceeded to hold them against their will? It would be easy to write off the multiple phone calls with the man speaking Spanish as some sort of cruel prank, but the circumstances are still pretty bizarre. In each of these calls, the man did not seem to understand English and only kept repeating the name and number of the person who answered the phone. It was only after he uttered the phrase, "I'm bringing them home," to Nathan and Billy Joe's sister, Onita, that the family began to suspect these calls were somehow connected to the 3 missing men. Onita found it especially interesting that the caller used the word them instead of him to imply there were multiple people involved. Both Nathan and Onita expressed their belief that after Billy Joe, Keith, and Franklin were picked up by the freighter, they were taken to a foreign country and held against their will. They suspected that the anonymous caller may have befriended the men and developed a conscience, which is why they provided him with Onita's name and phone number. So he was putting himself on the line to try and inform the Neesmith family about what was going on, but the problem was that he didn't know enough English to adequately explain everything. Now, the whole story about the sinking of the Casie Nicole and Nathan's rescue did receive a lot of coverage in mainstream publications, such as the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, after it happened, so I could see someone reading about it and deciding to torment the family with a series of prank calls, even though they did not start coming in until 6 months after the fact. But what adds an extra element of weirdness to the whole thing is that the Casie Nicole's original owner, Doug Tyson, was also receiving these calls. I mean, on their own, the calls to Oneida might not seem significant and could have just been some confused guy who kept phoning the wrong number and had trouble figuring it out because he spoke no English. But it seems like quite a coincidence that Tyson would be receiving the exact same type of calls at the exact same time. While Tyson was interviewed during the Unsolved Mystery segment, I never saw his name mentioned in any of the old newspaper articles I dug up about this case, so how many people out there would have even known he owned the Casie Nicole and had a connection to the event? However, Tyson was Billy Joe's employer, so theoretically, Billy Joe would have been able to provide someone with his name and phone number. Furthermore, if the whole thing was a prank, I'm not sure why the caller would decide to phone Oneida, not Nathan, the guy who received all the publicity from surviving the tragedy. But since the three men separated from Nathan, as far as they knew, he could have perished somewhere in the ocean, so that might explain why Billy Joe would have given Oneida's number to the caller. I can understand why the victims' families would have used these calls to maintain hope that they were still alive somewhere, but if they were picked up by the crew of the freighter, why would they be held in captivity for so long? One theory which has been pushed forward is that the freighter was involved in something illegal, like drug smuggling, and realized that they could not let the men go for fear they might talk. But if that's the case, then why not just kill them? What would be the purpose of taking them back to their home country and keeping them alive for months? I guess the other explanation is that they might have been holding the men captive as slaves or something, but what are the odds that people involved in that type of activity would happen to come across 3 guys floating on a hatch cover in the middle of the ocean and say, "Hey, just our luck, we can kidnap these guys and exploit them"? These calls also took place over a period of 5 months, and if they were all made by the same man, he obviously attempted to learn some English during that time period, since he used the phrase, "I'm bringing them home," during the last call, but why wouldn't he have attempted to learn more English in order to get his point across? Why not repeat the names of Billy Joe, Keith, or Franklin in order to specify who he's referring to? But while I can't provide much of an explanation for the phone calls, overall, it just seems a bit far-fetched to believe that the caller was a mysterious informant who was trying to tell people that the men were still alive. At the time the Unsolved Mysteries segment originally aired, the 3 men had been missing for just under 2 years, so there was a decent possibility they were still alive somewhere, but nothing has been heard about them since then. Even if they really were being held captive for a time period, it's highly unlikely that they're still alive 3 decades later. Occam's razor tells me that the whole thing was either some sort of misunderstanding or a series of mean-spirited crank calls, and while that explanation might not make much sense, prank callers are not exactly known for their logic. Like the story of the Freedon, this is another mystery involving a boat, which has just enough strange details to make you suspect there was more to the story than a simple drowning, but in the end, I think that's the most likely explanation. However, if you have any information to suggest that Billy Joe Neesmith, Keith Wilkes, and Franklin Brantley did not drown in the Atlantic Ocean and something else happened to them, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode about a final appeal segment from Unsolved Mysteries, which covered the controversial conviction of Paul Farrell for the murder of Kathy Ford, a victim whose body has still never been found. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to announce that next year, provided that it becomes safe to travel again, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing on Podcast Row at 2 separate CrimeCon events. The regular CrimeCon, which takes place at the Fairmont Hotel in Austin, Texas, from June 4th until the 6th, and the very first CrimeCon UK, which is being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London the following weekend on June the 12th and 13th. If you would like to purchase tickets to either event, we have a special promo code you can use to get a 10% discount, and it applies to both the Austin and London events. So to receive 10% off, either visit crimecon.com or crimecon.co.uk and enter the promo code COLE21. That's COLE21. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Marissa B., Lily B., Joe E., Eric Y., Caitlin J., Chow L., Deborah W., and Abigail B. Thank you all so much for your support. In addition, I also wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes of every episode, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which both contain interesting threads and discussions about both of today's featured cases. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.